Hello, hello. This is the very first section of Flipped Notes 1.1 for AP Psych. We're talking about the scientific foundations of psychology and specifically some of our early psychologists today. So first, I have with me our very special classmate, Sigmund Freud, who we'll be talking about in notes a little bit further along today. All right, our targets for this section are to recognize how the philosophical and physiological perspectives are really where we started in early psych. We want to look at some of the major historical figures in psych, and we'll talk about them all year, but introducing them now. And then look at some of the early theoretical approaches in explaining behavior. So we're here. What is psychology? So originally, psychology came from the two terms, psyche and ology, or the study of the soul, or the study of the mind. It did start way back. People have been thinking about, how people think and where all that comes from for a very long time, even with ancient civilizations like Egypt, Greece, China, India, and Persia. One of the other big questions, it's still a question today, what is the relation between the body and the mind? Some people felt like they were connected, the Hebrews, Aristotle, Augustine, while others said the mind and the body are more distinct, Socrates, Plato, and Descartes. But the question that really carries on today is, where do our ideas come from? How are they formed? Some of them are inborn, meaning you're born thinking that way. There are traits about you that are inborn. Socrates and Plato felt that that's where your traits came from, that you were just born that way. Lady Gaga would say you were born that way. The mind is a blank slate is the contrasting one, that you learned those things. You were born a blank slate and you learned things when you got here. And that's Aristotle and John Locke. Really, psychology today says it's a combination of the two, of both inborn and learned traits. But those are kind of questions we ask all year long. Was this something that you were born with, something you learned, or a combination of the two? So what about psychology today? What do we look at for psychology today? Today, we consider psychology to be the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So key words in there, scientific. So we're using the scientific method. We are looking at behaviors, outward actions, but we're also interested in the mental processes. So three key parts of that. Psychology does use the scientific method to try to prevent possible biases and really to have some precise and careful measurement. So really where psychology kind of got its start was in Leipzig, Germany in the mid-late 1800s with Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt. He's considered the father of all of psychology. And we consider him that because he established the very first psych lab to make psychology an independent discipline. So it was not part of philosophy, not part of physiology, but its very own science. So he established the first psych lab in 1879. Wundt's goal was to study consciousness, to study how we think, how the elements of the mind were organized, and how they related to one another. And his method for that was called introspection. And you may have heard of introspection because sometimes people are encouraged to think introspectively. And that's really looking inward, considering your own decisions and thinking, how you came to those thoughts. What is your full internal conscious experience? So from his establishment of a psych lab, psychology was born. So here we have Wundt in his first psych lab. If you're picturing something with mice running in mazes and monkeys in cages and maybe beakers of boiling chemicals, none of that. Really would have just been a room where he would have people sit down and talk about their conscious experiences. Because that's all he was concerned about. He was not doing any kind of experimental psychology. It was really kind of interviewing people and asking them about what they thought about. One of my favorite memes that kids have looked at or brought to me throughout the years, sometimes we like to call Wilhelm Wundt Daddy Wundt to remember that he is the father of psychology. So Wundt was very influential. People who wanted to study psychology had to go where he was. So kind of the center of the psychology world in the late 1800s was in Europe and in Leipzig in Germany. So some of his students then, including Americans, went to Germany, studied, and then brought back psychology to the US, including G. Stanley Hall, who established the first psych lab in the US in 1883. So I always remember him. I think of G. Stanley Hall established the first psychology hall, or maybe the Hall of Psychology in America. And then shortly after, lots of new psych labs started to pop up all over North America at different universities. Here we've got some maps showing some of that, primarily concentrated in New England, but that's because that's where most of the major universities were at that time. But over there on the West Coast, Stanford. And we can see down here that they were all founded by students of G. Stanley Hall, Wilhelm Wundt, and a couple of others who we'll talk about here in just a bit. So just as soon as psych was established, it already started to be divided in how people thought psychology should be studied. And so two intellectual schools of thought were established, and they were structuralism and functionalism. So Edward Tishner, who was a student of Wilhelm Wundt, kind of really establishes structuralism as this major branch of psychology. And they were all about studying consciousness, or the structure of the mind, into basic elements. And they used Wundt's method of introspection. So we've got Wundt and Tishner here. So they wanted to know, what are you thinking about? What are you experiencing? What sensations are you feeling? What thoughts and memories come to mind? In contrast, functionalism developed. Functionalism was led by William James, and even though G. Stanley Hall brought the first, or created the first psych lab in the US, William James is considered the first American psychologist, or the American father of psych. Because he was so influential, he wrote the first major psychology textbook, but his ideas became very, very prevalent. So he's our American father of psych. So instead of focusing on the structure of the mind, he wanted to study the purpose of our consciousness. He had been heavily influenced by Charles Darwin, who you may know from your other classes for his evolution ideas, but primarily, like, what are the functions or traits that people have, and animals specifically, that help them to survive. So, and survival of the fittest, natural selection, those are all Darwin's ideas. Well, William James started to bring those ideas in relation to human traits. So what is the function? Like, why do we get scared? Why are we happy? Why are people attracted to some things and not to others? What are the functions of those? So William James, he did criticize Wundt for being too narrow, and functionalism kind of becomes the leading idea. He did use introspection, but also questionnaires and some mental tests. William James coined the phrase stream of consciousness, which is the idea that your thoughts are constantly flowing. And I like the idea that he compares it to a stream, because sometimes your thoughts are just a little trickle of a river, and when you're tired and they're not thinking much, or sometimes when you're nervous, it's a raging river of thoughts. Sometimes maybe you heard of stream of consciousness humor, or comedy, and that's the idea where they just kind of, it's real fast and they talk about everything that comes to mind. But this idea that our thoughts never stop, they're constantly flowing, that originated from William James. So again, functionalism, the key idea there is, what is the purpose of what you're thinking about? Another type of psychology that starts to develop after structuralism and functionalism is gestalt psychology. And this one also has its roots in Germany. Max Wertheimer, he didn't like the idea that Wundt was breaking up the consciousness. He said, instead of looking at the parts, we should be looking at the whole, observing the whole experience rather than trying to break it down. And we'll get into this a lot more in the sensation perception unit. He said the whole is greater or different than the sum of its parts. So for example, when you look at me, you don't see hair and eyes and nose and arms and teeth and lips. You see a whole person. So he wanted to look at, why is it that our brains are able to organize things as a whole, and why don't we just look at the parts unless we are actually consciously trying to look at those parts. And we'll get into that more in a separate unit. Here in our Foundations of Psych, we'll talk about some of the early women in psych. Women had a bit of a hard time. Mary Woodin Calkins, she founded the first early psych lab at Wellesley College. She was the first woman president of the American Psychology Association. She probably should have been the first woman to get a PhD. She worked side by side a lot of the famous names in early psych in the US. And she should have got a PhD at Harvard, but Harvard refused simply because she was a woman. A lot of her male classmates actually protested, but to no effect. Harvard offered her a PhD from their sister college that was for women, and she said thanks, but no thanks. But the APA, she did still have her influence there. Margaret Floyd Washburn becomes the first woman instead to earn a PhD in psych, and she had to go to Cornell to do that. She was one of Tishner's students. Dorothea Dix, if you've already had US history, she may sound a little bit familiar. She was part of the progressive era, but she is considered the first advocate for people with mental illness. And when we get into the treatment unit, we'll talk more about what mental hospitals were like, but they were not very humane very early on. So she advocated against cruel treatments. She established the first mental asylum during the American Civil War. So going back to functionalism and structuralism, who won that battle? Most people would say that the functionalists did, because functionalism goes on to influence many other branches of psychology. Structuralism kind of goes away. Today, we don't really even consider structuralism and functionalism branches of psychology. However, functionalism becomes the root and leads on to become behaviorism, which is still today a major area of study. So applied psychology and behaviorism are the descendants of functionalism. Now getting into our next major name, and he's getting more into what we would consider contemporary psychology, right around the turn of the century in psychology, and that is Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud, we've got him here, and we'll reference him all throughout the year, was most famous for studying the unconscious mind. Sigmund Freud was Austrian, and we'll watch some video clips of him, and you'll hear his very distinctive accent. But he founded psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory believes in studying the unconscious mind. And for him, the unconscious mind was a level of the mind outside of our awareness. So Freud was really the first to focus on abnormal behavior. The other people early on, they were kind of studying the mind, but they were not actually treating any patients. Freud had people he was looking at who at the time were said to have hysteria. So hysteria was really kind of a broad term for they were very nervous, or there were other people who were melancholy was the other kind of diagnosis for the time, and that would be what we would call depression. So hysteria might have been anxiety and OCD. So he was really kind of the first to try to treat some people who had these problems. He believed that all behavior and mental processes were directed by unconscious forces, things that we were unaware of, and that those problems came from conflicts that existed in the unconscious mind. So much of his treatment was using free association, dream analysis. Early on, he used hypnosis, but very quickly he realized that that was not a very good method. But he wanted people to just talk freely. Just talk about whatever comes to mind. And let me skip ahead here for a second. His patients would often lie on the couch in his office. This is his famous office. Sometimes you see the picture of a patient lying on a couch and the doctor is sitting behind them taking notes. That method of treatment originated from Freud, that's how his patients would work, that through psychoanalysis, which was his method of treatment, patients would lie there and just talk about whatever came to mind. And whatever they started to talk about, he would say, oh, that may be related to something buried deep in your unconscious. His ideas were and still are very controversial. And a lot of that has to do with what he said was buried in the unconscious mind. So even though he's controversial, he's had a great influence on psychology in that he's encouraged people to think about, if it's not necessarily the unconscious mind, what is it? We'll talk about Freudian slips in class. So Freud's whole theory kind of centers around the idea of a mental iceberg. And he says there's three levels of the mind. The conscious level is the tip of the iceberg. It's what you can see, it's what you're aware of. And that includes your current thoughts, your current perceptions. But as we know with icebergs, that there is much more below the surface. And sometimes what's below the surface is actually what can be considered more dangerous or more powerful. He said at the subconscious level is where we have some of our memories, things that we may not have been thinking about, but if we tried to call it to mind, we could. Like what you did when you first found out about the pandemic, that's right there in your memories. Your stored knowledge, all that stuff that's not necessarily in your conscious level, but you could bring it up there if you wanted. But what Freud was most concerned about was the unconscious level, this deep part of the mind. So the word unconscious has a couple meanings. Unconscious is when you're asleep or you're knocked out, knocked unconscious, or you're in a coma. For Freud, the unconscious level was the specific kind of area or theoretical area of the mind. And it included all kinds of past memories that had been pushed deep down. These could be fears, these violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, selfish needs. So things, maybe you had a bad experience when you were a little kid and you don't remember it, but you were feeding the ducks and the duck bit your finger and now you're scared of ducks. He said there were unacceptable sexual desires, like maybe you had a crush on your cousin or your sibling. That's not okay. When you're a little kid, but sexual desires for family, that's unacceptable. So he said those thoughts, they were pushed down in there. Immoral urges, I want to stab somebody, or I wish that person wasn't alive. Things that, you're just not acceptable. So Freud said we all have these thoughts and these memories, but they are pushed into our unconscious level and we are unaware that they are there, but they influence our behavior. So this was, something that people didn't want to think about, this idea that you have sexual desires and they're influencing your behavior, but you don't know about it. People didn't like hearing about that. But he said that your behavior today is influenced by the unconscious, that, maybe you don't like this person and you don't really know why. It's because you have this unacceptable unconscious attraction to them. And so your behavior is that you show this dislike for them, even though maybe unconsciously you're in love with them. Or, these fears, or why do you have this anxiety or this sadness? And he said, well, we don't really know what it is, but it's based on something in your unconscious mind. So a lot of it, he said, was unconscious conflict related to sexuality was the biggest thing. Controversial notions, again, this is in the Victorian era, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and people didn't talk about sex. People didn't talk about feelings like that. So, and all of a sudden, here's Freud talking about these weird sexual desires that you have in your unconscious mind. So very controversial for his time. Now, most of Freud's theories came from his analysis of his own behavior, including his relationship with his mother and his family, and from some very long case studies of just a few very specific people. And then he generalized those theories to everybody. So there is no empirical data to support his theories. Empirical, this is one of our key words in this unit, is information that's based on experiments through formal and systematic observations and measurements. And it's not just a theory that somebody made up, which is what Freud did. So we don't have any data to support it. So today, he's not accepted as a valid theorist, or his theory is not accepted as valid. It's very interesting, and you can see connections like, oh, I could see how that could work, that kind of stuff. But he's not valid. He's not empirical. So we'll reference him a lot, but whenever we say these things about what his theory was, take it with a grain of salt because there's no empirical evidence. We'll mention a lot more of Freud's theories throughout the year, but that's our introduction for him, and that is all of 1.1.